Hello and welcome back to Technical Writing. Today we're going to be talking about writing definitions, descriptions, and instructions. So let's start with what are definitions, descriptions, and instructions. A definition is typically a brief explanation using words and sometimes graphics of an item or a concept. A description is typically a longer explanation, usually accompanied by graphics of either like an object, a mechanism, or a process. And then finally, a set of instructions is a kind of process description that is intended to enable a person to carry out a task. So, for example, I might define what a cell phone is to you. And that would be a definition. In my description, maybe I would go into a longer explanation explaining what a cell phone can do and sort of show you the process of using a cell phone. And then in the set of instructions, I would show you how to set up your new cell phone and connect it to your wireless carrier. So let's start with definitions. So the purpose of a definition is to clarify a description of either like a new development or a new technology, something that somebody is not yet familiar with. And definitions help specialists communicate with less knowledgeable readers. Definitions are usually going to be easily understandable by the general public. So let's talk about how do you write definitions when you're writing for a diverse audience. So one of the first things that you can do is create a glossary or a list of definitions. If you're using a word that you feel like your audiences might not be familiar with, give them the definition that you want them to have. Use simplified English and easily recognizable terms. So, English is a pretty predominant global language, but there are definitely variations. And say that, for example, the English that, we speak here in the United States versus the English that they speak in Kenya versus the English that they speak in Ireland versus the English that they speak in the Philippines. So just make sure that you're using simplified English and terms that are recognizable across a variety of dialects. Pay attention to key terms. Are you using the best words possible? And does everybody know what they are? And a lot of times using graphics to help readers understand a term or concept is very beneficial. Sometimes we'll see pretty much entirely graphics if we're writing to maybe people who don't speak the same language as us or something like that, which is why if you buy a piece of furniture from IKEA, the instructions are going to be in pictures or graphics, not in written language, because everybody can understand it. So let's talk about different types of definitions. The first one is just a parenthetical definition. This is where you put a brief clarification within an existing sentence. The computers were infected by a Trojan horse, a destructive program that appears to be benign. So for example, maybe you're reading the sentence, the computers were infected by a Trojan horse. You don't really need a definition. You understand what that means, but maybe not everybody will. So you're just going to include that brief parenthetical definition so that you can make sure that everybody's on the same page. Then you have a sentence definition. This is usually a little bit more formal. Usually it will include both an item and a category. So hypnoanalysis is a psychoanalytical technique in which hypnosis is used to elicit information from a patient's unconscious mind. So the term being defined here is hypnoanalysis. It's been given a category. It's a psychoanalytical technique, and it's been given its definition: hypnosis used to elicit information. And then we have extended definitions. These are going to be more detailed explanations. Usually these are one or more paragraphs, and they can be a definition of an object, of a process, or even of something like an idea. So there's some things that you can do to make sure that you are writing clear and effective definitions. So the first thing that you want to do is state the category and the distinguishing characteristics, but state it only once. So for example, technical writing class is a class where you learn business communication. It feels redundant. We don't need to state it twice. We can say something like technical writing is a class where you learn business communication. You also want to avoid circular definitions. This is a definition that a lot of times we see that basically uses the definition of a word to define the word, and it doesn't really work because at the end you don't really know any more information than what you had at the beginning. So a required course is a course that is required. Well, that doesn't really tell us much. We could probably assume based on the term required course that it was a course that is required, but even after that definition, we don't have any more information about it. So you want to make sure that there's a category that is like a noun or a noun phrase. So for example, a script is what actors use to read the dialogue for the play. Works, but maybe something like a script is a written copy of the dialogue for a play might work a little bit better. One of the things that it's important to know about definitions is that you have a lot of tools at your disposal and you can kind of play with it until you get it right. But let's go over some of those tools for extended definitions. Graphics. These are visual representations. If you're dealing with somebody who is a visual learner, a lot of times a graphic will do very quickly what words might be very difficult to do. So graphics can be great tools. Examples. These are especially useful in abstract definitions. You can do principles of operations. This is the way something works. Partition is when you go in and you divide an idea into smaller parts. Comparison and contrast is what is it like and what is it not like. And then, like, for example, a lot of times you might hear me say, in academic writing versus in technical writing, that's a comparison. That's how they're similar or how they're not similar. An analogy is a comparison to something that's different. A negation is explaining what something is not. And etymology is the defining of the root of the word. Sometimes if we know where a word comes from, it helps us make sense of how that word is being used. So let's talk about where you might find definitions in technical documents or where you might put definitions in your technical document. Sometimes they're just in the text. They just pop up right in the paragraph alongside whatever else you were saying. Sometimes we have glossaries or definitions listed in margins. You see this a lot of times in textbooks. Sometimes if it's like an online document, you might just see it in a hyperlink. This can be effective because if somebody doesn't need the definition, it doesn't interrupt their reading experience. But if somebody does need a definition, then they have a way to access that. Sometimes definitions pop up in footnotes, which are going to be notes at the end of the page that the word is mentioned on or that the term is mentioned on. A glossary is going to be a group of definitions, and an appendix is similar. It's going to have additional information, and a glossary and an appendix are both going to come at the end of a document. Now let's talk about descriptions. So when you are writing a description, you want to clearly indicate the nature and the scope of this description. Is it a brief description meant to give you a glimpse into an idea? Is it a more thorough description? Will you know everything about this concept by the time you're finished with the description? what's the nature and the scope of the description? Introduce the description clearly. Provide appropriate detail. It is your job to give your reader or your client everything that they need to know, and then descriptions always end with a brief conclusion. So if you're describing an item, here's some questions that you might want to consider or answer in an item description. What is the item? Or idea, or concept, or process. I used item here, but really any of those will work. What's the function of the item? What does it look like? How does it work? And what are the principal parts of the item? If you're describing a process, here's what you might want to ask. What is the process? What is the function of the process? When and where does the process take place? Who or what performs the process? Is this something that a human is doing or something that a machine is doing? How does the process work? And what are the basic steps or the principal steps in the process? Now, each time that you write a description, I know I mentioned this just a minute ago, but you're going to end with a brief conclusion. A lot of times, description conclusions will end with saying, like, and this is how all of the parts function together, and kind of explaining that, or helping your reader to understand what the steps are and why they, happen in that order and what they do, or even sometimes discussing the implication of the process. For example, after, all of these steps have been completed, here is the end result. Any of these are appropriate ways to end a description. You just want to always make sure that you have some kind of conclusion there. You can use graphics to accompany descriptions. Like I said earlier, graphics are a great way to communicate with broader audiences. So now that's descriptions. We talked about definitions. Let's talk about instructions. Before you sit down to write instructions, there are some questions that you will want to ask yourself. First off, what are your readers' expectations? What are they trying to get from this document that you are creating? There's nothing more frustrating than opening up, a set of instructions and it's incomplete, or the assumption is that you're going to know how to do something that maybe you don't quite know how to do, and it doesn't really explain it well. What is it that you think your readers really expect to get out of these instructions? What are your readers' abilities? If you're going to say to your reader, complete this step, but they don't know how to do that, then you may need to give some more information. So think about, what are your readers' abilities? Think about, do you need to create more than one set of instructions for different audiences? What language should you use? And are you going to publish this in multiple languages? And if you are, how is that going to affect the words that you use? Will readers be anxious about this information? There are, sometimes we get instructions and it seems like a very, low stake type of thing. It's summer right now in Texas. I recently bought an additional fan for my house. There was instructions on how to plug it in. I didn't feel like that was a very high stakes operation. I could figure it out. There was a very small likelihood that it was going to go wrong. Recently, my son built a computer, and there was instructions on how to attach the motherboard to another part. I'm not very computer literate, so I'm not even going to pretend to know what the instructions were talking about, but I was very aware that if he messed up this step and broke something or did something wrong, it could cost hundreds of dollars to fix that mistake. So, in that situation, maybe the reader is way more anxious about the information that they're getting. If you're reading instructions on something that's related to finances or health or one of those really important topics, your reader might be more anxious or more nervous, and you should be thinking about how can I provide them everything that they need to be confident in their ability to do this. And will the environment in which instructions are read affect the document design? So, for example, a lot of, I'm going to use cookbooks for an example. A lot of cookbooks are printed on paper that is resistant to liquids because they're going to be used in the kitchen and there's a chance that something could spill. So, don't print, a recipe on paper where if it gets wet, the ink is going to smear and then it's not going to be readable. Obviously, this is a kind of a lighthearted, silly example, but think about where are these instructions going to be read and does it affect how you are going to produce this document? You do want to make sure that you're providing attractive instructions. We can see that the example on the left is very cluttered. There's a lot of information. It can be difficult to sort of pull what you need out of different sections of that information. So maybe there was a concern about how much paper they were using. But it's way more difficult to use cluttered instructions than it is to use instructions that are better spaced out. So we can see an example of more attractive instructions on the right. Let's talk about important signal words that are going to pop up in instructions and what they mean specifically, because they do not all mean the same thing. So if you see danger in instructions, this means that there is an immediate and serious hazard that could likely be fatal. Sticking a fork in an electrical socket is dangerous. It can kill you, right? If you need to, indicate something in your instructions is dangerous, that it could include a serious hazard that could be fatal, danger is the word that you're going to use. Warning indicates a potential for a serious injury, for a death, or for damage to equipment. So warning is a little bit more of a broad term. And then caution indicates something could go wrong, from a moderate injury to equipment damage to destruction, something like that. And then if you see note, this is going to indicate, this is just a tip or a suggestion that will help the readers, but there's not likely going to be any harm caused if they don't pay a lot of attention to what the note is saying. And then we also see safety labels that are going to include these same signal words. So when you write instructions, pay attention to if you need to use these signal words, when you need to use these signal words, and how that is going to work in terms of the instructions that you are creating. There are instruction elements that are going to pop up in most instruction documents. A title. This is going to be, what is this the instructions for? A general introduction. You're going to have step-by-step instructions. And then you will have a conclusion. Your conclusion is where you share any more information that the reader needs to know. So let's talk about titles. Begin with clear, simple titles that explain what is going on. You can use a gerund or a how-to statement. How to install the J112 shock absorber, or installing the J112 shock absorber. You want to avoid noun strings, just like in the titles that we talked about in the last lecture video. So J112 shock absorber installation instructions. It's just a little bit more difficult to get the information from that title. And then a lot of times if instructions have a lot of information in them, there's a table of contents. This is going to go over sort of what's in the instructions, convention sections, this is going to be like, what tools do you need, or what is it assuming that you know to complete this, where to get help section. A lot of times this is like, here's how you call customer service if you have questions. And then a list of trademarks, or maybe even a glossary of terms, or maybe even a legend that defines certain symbols or images. So when you are writing instructions, there's some things that you should think about, like who is going to carry out this task. Is it important that this task is done by an adult? Is it important that this task is done by an electrician, right? Or can anybody do this task? Why should the reader carry out this task? If you put this item together incorrectly, is something bad going to happen? If you don't attach this bookcase to the wall, does it have the potential to fall and hurt a child? Those sorts of things. When should the reader carry out this task? It probably does not matter if you are going to build a bookcase at 3 p.m. or 3 a.m. But if you're going to stain that bookcase, you need to do it in certain weather conditions. So sometimes certain tasks should be done at particular times. What safety measures or other concerns do you need the reader to understand? If you're going to be staining that bookcase, you need to make sure that you're doing it in a well-ventilated area. Are you including all of these safety concerns? What items will the reader need? You don't want your reader to be sitting in the floor building this bookcase, and then all of a sudden we need a Phillips head screwdriver when we've been using a flathead this entire time, and they have to get up and search for it, and all of the work that they've just done falls apart, because that's what seems to happen when you step away or you lose one tiny step in building a bookcase. And how long will the task take? Just kind of a reasonable expectation. I remember years ago, my husband and I built bunk beds for our children, and they were from IKEA, and we thought, oh, this probably won't be that complicated. It took like 9 hours. Had I known that it was going to take that long and be that difficult of a process, I would have started it the next morning, right? So just a general estimate. It will take most people, X number of hours or days, or how long is this process going to be? Maybe it's only 30 minutes, just kind of a reasonable expectation. Now you get to your steps. Number the steps. Step 1, step 2, step 3. This helps your reader know where they are in the process and also make sure that they're not missing something. Present the right amount of information in each step. Use the imperative mood. This is the verb form using to command. So for example, you're going to say, don't put the fork in the electrical outlet. Don't confuse steps and feedback. Steps and feedback are not the same thing. Feedback is comments that you want to make after they have completed a step or completed the instruction. Include graphics, and do not omit articles to save space. So for example, there's a difference in saying put the screw in the hole versus put a screw in the hole, and your readers need to know that. Make sure that if you need an appendix in your instructions, it is there. Are there specifications that you need your reader to know? Are there safety regulations or industry standards that you want your reader to know? Are there tips on maintenance or servicing what they have just put together? A lot of times, there's copyright information, an index where we can sort of get more information, or a glossary that has defined the terms. When you are writing instructions for multicultural readers, there's some things that you want to think about. First of all, in what language should the information be written? A lot of times, if you're looking at instructions and they're written locally, we see them written in English and Spanish because those are the most predominant languages in our area. Or I know in Tarrant County, If you download a sample ballot with instructions on how to vote, it's in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese because those are the most predominant languages in Tarrant County. So think about what language should the information be written in. Do you need to modify the texts and the graphics? And if so, how? Excuse me. And what are the reader's technological infrastructure? Are they going to be reading this on paper? Are they going to be reading it digitally? Does it make a difference in how you present these instructions? If you have questions on definitions, descriptions, or instructions, let me know. Reach out. I have resources for you in our online classroom. And then, of course, I'm always available to answer questions. Have a nice day, guys.